Now we quote the American Christian magazine, March-April issue, 1997. Antinomians claim that the law was replaced by grace under a new and different dispensation instated by Jesus. Now in the final years of the 20th century, lawlessness, like a noxious weed, has taken over the hearts and minds of children and adults alike. It has grown so thick that the seeds of truth are prevented from germinating and competing with the weeds. Very few of us even remember when things weren't this way. End quote. Now, dispensationalism teaches that the Ten Commandments were done away with by Christ. No wonder the church is failing to reach a higher moral standard. They have none. And antinomian means anti-law. Nomos is law in the Greek. How does heaven feel about this teaching? And I quote Jesus, "Whoso therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven." He's a low life as far as heaven's concerned. "But whosoever shall teach and do them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." That's Matthew 5, verse 19. Notice, according to this article, that this anti-law attitude is a relatively new phenomenon. He says, in the final years of the 20th century, this lawlessness has taken over. Very few of us remember when things weren't this way. So it's a fairly recent development. In ages past, this wasn't so. Now, here's an article from the managing editor of WorldNet Daily, the world's largest internet news website. And he acknowledges this is also a recent phenomenon. Quote, "In ages past, Christians dwelt a lot more on the concept of taking up the cross than they do these days. Oh, sure, a well-intentioned minister will reverently read one of the scriptures on taking up the cross, might even briefly plug the idea of self-denial, but too often this amounts to a polite nod to a notion that seems both archaic and almost irrelevant, or at least unattainable. And the pastor just moves on to more pleasant topics like how grateful we are that we're saved by Christ's death and resurrection." Now, I'm going to interject here. I am eternally grateful for Christ's death and resurrection. Without these, we could never be saved. But how ungrateful it would be of me to go right on ahead breaking the Ten Commandments when it was because of my doing so that he had to die in the first place. Now, if we're grateful, let's not crucify him afresh. Now I'm going to quote Paul in Romans 3:31. "Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law." Now back to the article. It wasn't always so. Again, he recognizes this is a recent phenomenon, this anti-law philosophy. It wasn't always so. Throughout past centuries, Christians dwelt at length on the crucial need for repentance, mortification of the sinful man, death to self, and so forth. That was David Kupelian, February 27th, 2004, the managing editor of WorldNet Daily. Now, this anti-law Christianity was predicted by Seventh-day Adventists. Over 100 years ago, when we pointed out that Sunday was not the Sabbath of the Fourth Commandment, many people of other denominations came along. But the churches that didn't tried to do away with God's commandments to avoid the bother of changing. And so, breaking from their previous historical understanding, Sunday preachers began teaching that the moral law was nailed to the cross along with the ceremonial laws regarding the sanctuary service. You see a reference to that in Colossians 2:14. But here was the prediction back in 1888. As the claims of the Fourth Commandment are urged upon the people, it is found that the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath is enjoined, and as the only way to free themselves from a duty which they are unwilling to perform, many popular teachers declare that God's law is no longer binding. Thus they cast away the law and the Sabbath together. As the work of Sabbath reform extends, this rejection of the divine law to avoid the claims of the Fourth Commandment will become well nigh universal. And that's what we've read, isn't it? The Gallup poll, Billy Graham, and so on. Friends, this was a prophecy that has indeed come to pass. Now, continuing that same article, page 587 of The Great Controversy, I quote, "The teachings of religious leaders have opened the door to infidelity and to contempt for God's holy law. And upon these leaders rests a fearful responsibility for the iniquity that exists in the Christian world. Yet this very class put forth the claims that the fast-spreading corruption is largely attributable to the desecration of the so-called Christian Sabbath, and that the enforcement of Sunday observance would greatly improve the morals of society. Now, these are the ones that have demoralized the world by rejecting the true Sabbath. This claim is especially urged in America, where the doctrine of the true Sabbath has been most widely preached. End quote. Friends, the result of rejecting the Sabbath truth were disastrous. To excuse their resistance of this light, Sunday preachers began saying that the law was done away with. And this is what began the recent trend wherein Christianity is now failing so miserably to keep God's moral law. But soon the pendulum will swing from one extreme to the other, and according to this prophecy, written in 1888, these Christians will go from denying God's law to enforcing it. Now that's legalism. And again, they say, well, the corruption is because of the desecration of Sunday. One example of this kind of thinking comes from Dr. D. James Kennedy. Now, he just recently died, but he was the pastor of a 10,000-member Presbyterian church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the Coral Ridge Church, which was broadcasting by radio to an audience of some 3 million people across the U.S. and in 200 other nations. And notice the tie here between secular interests, i.e. our nation's war, and God's commandments. Notice also the article's title, No Rest on the Sabbath for Iraq War Debate. This is USA Today, March 25th, 2003. And now I quote the reporter. Kennedy talked about the moral obligation to fight for freedom. He called for trust in God and for the protection of the troops abroad and the nation at home. He referred to George Washington, who urged citizens to obey God's laws. Hey, it's one thing to urge, but to legislate, that's going too far, friends. And that's where this is headed. If we're offending God and robbing our nation of the blessings of heaven on our battles, listen to that, would you please? Is Jesus blessing our battles, helping those bullets to meet their target and so forth? Give me a break. If we're offending God, and the implication is, by not keeping His commandments, we're robbing our nation of the blessings of heaven on our battles. It is the soldiers who bear the brunt. So the reason we're not winning the war over there, we're not able to kill them all, is because we're not keeping God's commandments. Well, anyone in particular?